On January 8th, 2025, Jensen Huang, the CEO of Nvidia, said one sentence at a conference in Las Vegas that wiped out billions of dollars in market value in a single afternoon. He said useful quantum computers were probably 15 to 30 years away. IonQ's stock crashed 39% that day. Rigetti lost 45% of its value before the closing bell. The entire quantum computing industry watched the most powerful chipmaker on Earth publicly shrug at their life's work. Fast forward to April of 2026, and that same company, the one that had just called quantum computing a decades-away fantasy, quietly flipped a switch that sent those exact same stocks soaring more than 50% in a single week. What changed? Nvidia stopped talking about quantum computing as something far away and started building the bridge that connects it directly to the machines already running the entire modern world. To understand why that bridge matters so much, you first need to understand a problem that has quietly haunted quantum computing since the very first working prototype was switched on decades ago. Quantum computers are extraordinary at one very specific thing: exploiting the strange rules of subatomic physics to explore an almost incomprehensible number of possibilities simultaneously, the kind of problem that would take a classical computer longer than the age of the universe to brute force through one calculation at a time. But here's the part almost nobody outside the field talks about. A quantum computer, on its own, is nearly useless. The qubits at the heart of these machines are so fragile that the faintest whisper of heat, vibration, or stray electromagnetic noise from the outside world can corrupt the information they're holding in a matter of microseconds. To actually get a usable answer out of a quantum processor, you need a constant, blisteringly fast stream of classical computation running alongside it in real time, checking for errors, correcting them, recalibrating the hardware, and translating the whole chaotic process into something a human being can actually read and use. For years, that supporting classical computation lived somewhere far away, on cloud servers you'd log into over the internet, sending your quantum job off into the void, and waiting, sometimes for hours, for a result to come back. It was a bit like owning a Formula One engine, but being forced to communicate with your pit crew by mail. The engine might be revolutionary, but if your pit crew can't respond in real time, you're never actually going to win the race. That mail in your instructions problem is exactly what collapsed in 2025 and 2026, and the company that tore it down wasn't one of the quantum computing startups everyone had their eyes on. It was Nvidia, the company that had spent the previous decade quietly becoming the most valuable business on the planet by building the graphics processing units, or GPUs, that now power almost every major artificial intelligence system in existence. In November of 2025, Nvidia unveiled something called NVQLink, and if you strip away the marketing language, what it actually does is deceptively simple to describe and staggeringly difficult to build. NVQLink is a direct, ultra-fast connection between Nvidia's GPU supercomputers and the control systems that run a quantum processor, allowing information to flow between the two in under 4 microseconds at a throughput of 400 gigabits per second. To put that speed in perspective, 4 microseconds is roughly the time it takes a hummingbird's wing to move a tiny fraction of a single beat. In that impossibly short window, NVQLink allows a classical GPU supercomputer to read the current state of a fragile quantum processor, calculate what's going wrong, and send back a correction, all before the quantum information has a chance to decay into useless noise. For the first time in the history of this technology, the quantum computer and the classical supercomputer that keeps it alive don't have to live in different buildings, communicating through the digital equivalent of a mailbox. They can sit right next to each other, wired directly together, behaving less like two separate machines and more like a single unified system. This wasn't a solo effort dreamed up in a vacuum at Nvidia's headquarters either, and understanding who actually helped build this technology tells you just how seriously the entire scientific establishment is taking it. The development of NVQLink was guided directly by researchers from 9 of America's most important national laboratories: Brookhaven, Fermilab, Lawrence Berkeley, Los Alamos, MIT Lincoln Laboratory, Oak Ridge, Pacific Northwest, and Sandia National Laboratories. These aren't marketing partners looking for a press release. These are the institutions that historically split the atom, mapped the human genome, and built some of the most sophisticated scientific instruments humanity has ever created. And all of them decided this specific piece of connective technology was worth lending their expertise to. At launch, 17 different companies building quantum processors and 5 separate companies building the control systems those processors depend on signed on to support NVQLink, including names like Rigetti, CQC, and Silicon Quantum Computing. And by the time the SC25 Supercomputing Conference rolled around in November of 2025, more than a dozen additional research institutions across Asia and Europe had joined as well, turning what started as an American initiative into something closer to a genuine global standard almost overnight. Now, technology announcements happen constantly in this industry, And it would be easy to write this off as one more press release destined to be forgotten in 6 months. What separates NVQLink from the usual noise is a single demonstration that happened almost immediately after launch. And it's the kind of result that makes physicists sit up straight in their chairs. Quantinuum, one of the leading quantum computing companies in the world, connected its newest trapped ion quantum processor called Helios directly to an Nvidia GH200 Grace Hopper superchip using NVQLink. Together, they accomplished something that had never been done before, anywhere, by anyone. The world's first real-time use of a scalable decoder for a particularly difficult and important class of quantum error correction known as QLDPC codes. The specific numbers behind that result are worth sitting with for a moment, because they tell the whole story on their own. Helios required its supporting classical computer to detect and correct errors within a strict 2-millisecond window in order to keep the quantum information usable. The decoder, running through NVQLink, didn't just meet that deadline. It responded in a median time of just 67 microseconds, roughly 32 times faster than what was actually required, while simultaneously improving the overall error rate of the system by a factor of 5.4. Jensen Huang, the same executive, whose offhand comment about quantum computing being decades away had crashed the sector's stock prices barely a year earlier, described this new architecture in strikingly different language, saying that future supercomputers will be quantum GPU systems, combining the quantum computer's unique ability to simulate nature itself with the GPU's raw programmability and massive parallel processing power, and calling NVQLink, paired with Nvidia's software platform CUDA-Q, the gateway to that future. That software platform, CUDA-Q, deserves its own explanation, because it's really the second half of what makes this entire story work, and it's just as important as the physical interconnect itself. Think of NVQLink as the high-speed physical road connecting two cities, and CUDA-Q as the actual traffic system, the rules, signals, and vehicles that let people and goods move efficiently along that road once it exists. CUDA-Q is Nvidia's open quantum processor agnostic software platform, meaning it doesn't care whether the quantum hardware on the other end uses superconducting circuits, trapped ions, photons, or any other exotic physical approach to building a qubit. It allows a single piece of software code to run computations seamlessly across GPUs, ordinary CPUs, and quantum processors all at once, inside one unified program, rather than forcing a researcher to write entirely separate code for each individual piece of hardware and then stitch the results together by hand. Buried inside CUDA-Q are specialized libraries built specifically for the hardest unsolved problems in the field, including one called QEC, dedicated entirely to quantum error correction, and another called solvers, built for the kind of hybrid algorithms that split a calculation between classical and quantum hardware depending on which part of the problem each one is actually good at. This is the layer of software that turned NVQLink from an impressive piece of wiring into something researchers around the world could actually build real, working applications on top of. And those applications didn't stay confined to a single lab or a single hardware partner. In June of 2026, at the ISC Supercomputing Conference in Hamburg, a French company called Quandela, which builds quantum processors out of individual particles of light rather than electrical circuits, announced it had successfully validated its own low-latency connection to Nvidia's infrastructure using NVQLink, working alongside a specialized control system built on programmable hardware called an FPGA. Sam Stanwyck, Nvidia's director of quantum product, described the result as showing how quantum GPU supercomputing systems are going to fundamentally change the way we think about computing applications altogether, because information can now pass seamlessly between completely different kinds of processors that were never designed to talk to each other in the first place. Just a few. Months earlier, in March of 2026, at Nvidia's own GTC Developer Conference, researchers at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory unveiled an open-source framework built specifically to give scientists and engineers a way to explore quantum control and measurement in far more depth than the typical cloud-based quantum service ever allowed, again built around a tight integration between Nvidia's GH200 superchips and an FPGA-based control system. Sam Stein, the project's lead computer scientist at PNNL, explained that the collaboration was designed to leverage high-performance classical GPU processors to meet the demanding, split-second computational requirements that quantum processors need in order to function properly, and crucially, the team made the entire framework open source, meaning any research group in the world, not just the handful of companies with the deepest pockets, could start experimenting with the same tight quantum GPU integration for themselves. The improvements weren't limited to raw speed either. A separate French company called Alice and Bob, which builds a specialized and unusually resilient type of qubit known as a cat qubit, used Nvidia's CUDA-Q platform to run massive simulations, validating a brand new error correction method they call elevator codes, designed specifically around the unique noise patterns their particular hardware produces. Running those simulations on an Nvidia GH200 chip, the team measured a 9.25 times speedup compared to older methods running on standard classical processors, taking a task that used to require 18 hours of computation down to a small fraction of that time. Multiply that kind of speed up across the dozens of research teams and companies now plugged into this same ecosystem, and you start to understand why this isn't just one interesting result from one company. It's a pattern repeating itself independently across multiple continents, multiple completely different types of quantum hardware, and multiple totally unrelated research teams, all converging on the exact same conclusion at almost exactly the same time. Tightly coupling quantum processors directly to Nvidia's GPU infrastructure isn't just convenient. It's solving problems that were, until extremely recently, considered some of the hardest open questions in the entire field. If all of that sounds impressive but somewhat abstract, the moment this story became impossible to ignore for anyone paying attention to financial markets arrived in mid-April of 2026, and it's worth walking through exactly what happened, because it shows just how much weight the rest of the industry now places on anything Nvidia does in this space. On April 14th, Nvidia revealed that IonQ, one of the largest and most closely watched publicly traded quantum computing. Companies in the world had become an early adopter of a new piece of technology Nvidia called the Ising calibration model. IonQ stock jumped 20.19% that same day, closing at $35.77. Rigetti Computing, mentioned in the very same announcement, climbed 11.50%, closing at $16.87. Nvidia's own stock, for context, moved a comparatively modest 3.73% that day, even though the company was already worth close to $4.77 trillion at the time. Analysts covering the sector immediately described what happened as a textbook example of what they called the Nvidia halo effect, drawing a direct comparison to what happened years earlier in the artificial intelligence data center industry when Nvidia's CUDA software platform became the unquestioned global standard and, in doing so, lifted the value of an entire surrounding ecosystem of hardware companies simply by association. When a company worth nearly $5 trillion decides to plant its flag inside a new and previously speculative corner of technology, it sends an unmistakable signal to the rest of the market. Whether that signal is fully deserved or not, this sector just moved from being a scientific curiosity to something the smartest, most disciplined capital allocators in the world are willing to build real infrastructure around. That single-day rally turned out to be only the opening act. Just 2 days later, on the same week that happened to fall on World Quantum Day, Nvidia went further and released an entirely new set of open-source artificial intelligence models, specifically built to accelerate quantum computing's two hardest and most persistent bottlenecks: qubit calibration, the delicate process of tuning a quantum processor's physical hardware into working order, and error correction decoding, the constant split-second work of catching and fixing mistakes before they corrupt an entire calculation. Nvidia's own team described these new models, which they named Ising, as delivering the best available performance on both of those tasks, and framed the underlying insight in a way that reframes how you should think about this entire story. Sam Stanwyck put it directly: calibration and decoding are, in his words, AI-shaped problems, meaning they're exactly the kind of pattern recognition, prediction-heavy tasks that modern artificial intelligence models happen to be spectacularly good at solving, faster and more accurately than the older, purely deterministic mathematical approaches the field had relied on for years. Reported figures put the improvement at roughly 2.5 times faster and 3 times more accurate than prior methods. The market's reaction this time wasn't just a one-day pop. Over the course of that entire week, IonQ's stock rose more than 50%. A D-Wave Quantum climbed by a similar margin. Rigetti Computing and Quantum Computing Incorporated both surged more than 30% each. 4 different publicly traded companies, building 4 genuinely different types of quantum hardware, all rose dramatically in the same short window, driven by the same underlying announcement from a company that, technically speaking, doesn't build quantum computers at all. That last point is worth dwelling on for a moment because it's the single most important nuance in this entire story, the thing that separates a genuinely disruptive shift from simple market hype. Nvidia has been remarkably direct and consistent about this distinction, even as its influence over the sector has exploded. The company has said plainly that it does not build quantum computers and that it doesn't intend to start. What it has built instead is something arguably more foundational: the connective infrastructure and software layer that determines whether all of these different competing quantum hardware companies, using wildly different physical approaches, can actually be plugged into the existing world of classical GPU-powered supercomputing that already runs the majority of the planet's advanced scientific research, financial modeling, and artificial intelligence systems. That's an enormously consequential role to occupy, and it's one Nvidia has occupied successfully once already in the artificial intelligence boom that made it the most valuable company in history by owning the software and hardware standard that virtually every AI researcher and company in the world eventually chose to build on top of, rather than trying to compete against dozens of AI startups directly. The pattern repeating itself here in quantum computing is unmistakable, and it explains why so many of these individual pure-play quantum companies, despite competing fiercely against each other for hardware supremacy, have all rushed to integrate with the exact same underlying Nvidia infrastructure, rather than trying to build their own competing version from scratch. The timing of all this corporate and technological momentum has also lined up almost perfectly with a wave of new government attention and funding, and that convergence matters enormously for how seriously this technology should be taken going forward. On June 22nd of 2026, the President signed a set of executive orders specifically targeting national quantum computing capabilities and cryptographic defense, establishing an initiative called the Quantum Computer for Application Development and Discovery Science, coordinating the Department of Energy, the Department of War, the Department of Commerce, and the U.S. intelligence community around a shared goal, delivering a genuinely science-capable quantum computer to a Department of Energy facility by 2028, alongside a separate mandate to field next-generation quantum sensors by September 30th of the same year. Analysts who track this sector closely describe the executive order as converting an already substantial $2 billion federal funding commitment into a structured timeline with hard, specific deadlines attached to individual government agencies, which in turn dramatically raises the near-term visibility and credibility of government-backed revenue for exactly the companies now building on Nvidia's quantum infrastructure. When you have national laboratories helping design the underlying interconnect, a presidential executive order setting concrete delivery deadlines just 2 years out, and half a dozen independent companies across multiple countries, all reporting successful integrations within months of each other, you're no longer looking at a speculative trend. You're looking at the early, unmistakable formation of an entire new layer of computing infrastructure, one being built methodically and deliberately, rather than stumbled into by accident. It's worth pausing here to genuinely appreciate the individual companies riding this wave because their stories, taken together, paint a picture of an industry that's maturing far faster than most outside observers realize. IonQ, currently the largest publicly traded pure-play quantum computing company by revenue, generated roughly $130 million in 2025 sales, with guidance for 2026 projecting revenue between $225 and $245 million. The company has been aggressively acquiring capabilities beyond raw quantum hardware, including the semiconductor fabrication company SkyWater Technology, giving it direct manufacturing control that Nvidia's efficiency-boosting software can now amplify even further. Rigetti Computing delivered a 108-qubit system called Cepheus and secured an $8.4 million contract with India's Center for Development of Advanced Computing, while analysts project the company's 2026 revenue could grow by as much as 255% year over year. D-Wave Quantum, meanwhile, reported record cash reserves of $884.5 million, giving it an unusually strong financial cushion compared to many of its peers, alongside a new $20 million research agreement with Florida Atlantic University. And Quantum Computing Incorporated has been diversifying aggressively, acquiring a semiconductor company called Luminar Semiconductor at the start of 2026 to strengthen its own chip design and fabrication capabilities, while simultaneously scaling up a dedicated photonic chip manufacturing facility that's already begun generating its first meaningful revenue. None of these companies are direct competitors to Nvidia. All of them are in different ways becoming dependent on the infrastructure Nvidia has built. The same way an entire generation of artificial intelligence startups became dependent on Nvidia's GPUs and CUDA software a decade earlier. But here's where an honest, carefully researched account of this story has to pump the brakes slightly, because getting ahead of the actual science would do a disservice to just how genuinely impressive the real, grounded version of this story already is. Quantum computing today, even with all of this remarkable new connective infrastructure, remains firmly inside what physicists call the noisy intermediate-scale quantum era, often abbreviated NISQ. Today's most advanced quantum processors top out somewhere in the low hundreds to low thousands of physical qubits, and their error rates still require exactly the kind of aggressive, real-time correction that NVQLink and CUDA-Q were specifically built to provide. Multiple financial analysts who track this sector closely have been consistent in describing genuine, economically meaningful quantum advantage on real-world problems as a late-decade story, not something that has already fully arrived. What Nvidia has actually built and proven in carefully documented, verifiable technical demonstrations is narrower and more specific than the headline "quantum computing has arrived" would suggest. And it's worth stating that narrower claim precisely because the precise version is still remarkable enough to justify everything that's happened in the markets around it. Nvidia has built the connective tissue, the interconnect, and the surrounding software stack that allows classical GPU supercomputing to sit directly alongside quantum hardware with microsecond scale latency. And in doing so, it has solved a specific, previously unsolved, genuinely important engineering bottleneck: the ability to perform real-time quantum error correction and calibration fast enough to actually keep a quantum processor useful while it's running. That is not the same claim as quantum computers can now solve problems classical computers cannot. It is, instead, the claim that the biggest practical obstacle standing between today's fragile, error-prone quantum hardware and tomorrow's genuinely useful, fault-tolerant quantum computers has just gotten dramatically smaller, faster, and more solvable than it was even 18 months ago. And that distinction, precise as it sounds, is exactly why this particular development deserves the dramatic framing it's received, rather than being dismissed as just another overhyped tech headline destined to fade by next quarter. Every previous generation of computing revolution has followed roughly the same pattern. A genuinely transformative new capability exists in isolated specialized labs for years, sometimes decades, before someone builds the unglamorous, overlooked connective infrastructure that lets that capability actually plug into the tools, workflows, and industries the rest of the world already depends on. The internet existed in research labs for 2 decades before consumer-friendly browsers and reliable networking infrastructure turned it into the defining technology of an era. Artificial intelligence research existed in university basements for half a century before GPUs, cheap cloud computing, and platforms like CUDA turned it into the force reshaping the global economy today. Quantum computing has spent the last 3 decades in that exact same isolated specialized lab phase, brilliant in principle, but stubbornly disconnected from the classical computing infrastructure the rest of the world actually runs on. What changed in the past 12 months isn't that quantum computers suddenly got dramatically better on their own. What changed is that the company sitting at the center of the entire modern computing industry, the same company whose chips already train the world's most advanced artificial intelligence models, decided to build the bridge connecting its own infrastructure directly to quantum hardware, wiring the two together with a speed and precision nobody thought was achievable this soon. 9 national laboratories helped design it. 17 quantum hardware companies signed on to build for it. A trapped ion quantum computer used it to shatter a world record in real-time error correction within weeks of launch. And an industry that Jensen Huang himself had publicly written off as decades away just 18 months earlier is now the fastest moving, best connected, most rapidly maturing corner of the entire technology sector, precisely because the world's most valuable chipmaker finally decided to stop watching from a distance and start building the road that connects it directly to everything else.